Some words are so old that entire kingdoms would rather bury them than remember them. The last guests had already left the ballroom when Tessa Morgan pushed her cleaning cart across the polished marble floor. Midnight had settled over downtown Chicago, turning the towering windows of Crimson Hall into black mirrors. The enormous chandeliers overhead still glowed with soft golden light, the scattering reflections across the empty room like fallen stars. To most people, it was just another luxury event venue. To Tessa, it was a place where powerful people gathered, where she worked long hours, and where nobody ever seemed to notice she existed. She preferred it that way. Her worn sneakers squeaked softly against the marble as she moved between rows of empty tables. Crystal glasses stood abandoned beside untouched plates. Velvet chairs sat perfectly aligned beneath towering columns carved with strange patterns she had never understood. The ballroom felt different after midnight, quieter, older, almost like it was holding its breath. Tessa paused near the center of the room and looked up. Hundreds of candles flickered inside glass fixtures suspended 40 feet above her head. The warm light painted the room gold, but it never quite chased away the shadows. She adjusted her cleaning gloves and continued working. Across the ballroom, several guests remained behind. Men and women dressed in dark formal clothing stood in small groups speaking quietly. Event staff had warned cleaners never to interrupt them. They were important donors, executives, diplomats, people whose names appeared in newspapers. Tessa never paid much attention. Rich people all looked the same from a distance. A sudden draft swept through the room. One of the large side doors had been left partially open. The gust rattled nearby candles. Several flames flickered dangerously. Tessa sighed and steered her cart toward the door. If the candles went out, the manager would blame the cleaning crew somehow. The door was heavier than she expected. She pulled it shut and secured instantly. "Finally," she muttered. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she whispered a phrase she had heard countless times growing up. Her grandmother used to say it whenever storms passed. Whenever windows were closed, whenever peace returned after chaos, may silence guard the house and memory guard the night. The words left her mouth so naturally she barely thought about them. But someone else did. The effect was immediate. Conversations stopped, footsteps stopped, even the faint clinking of glasses vanished. Tessa looked up. Every person in the ballroom was staring at her. For a moment she thought something had spilled onto her uniform. Maybe she had said something aloud without realizing it. The silence stretched 1 second, 2 seconds, 5. Nobody moved. A woman near the far wall looked as though she had forgotten how to breathe. An older man holding a crystal glass slowly lowered it without taking his eyes off Tessa. Another guest exchanged a startled glance with someone beside him. The atmosphere changed so suddenly that a chill traveled down her spine. Sorry, Tessa said. No one answered. Then, from somewhere near the elevated gallery overlooking the ballroom, a chair scraped against stone. The sound echoed through the room. Tessa followed the noise instinctively. A tall figure stood near the railing above, dressed entirely in black. Watching. The distance made his features impossible to see clearly, but something about his presence commanded attention, not because he moved, because everyone else seemed to react to him. Several guests immediately lowered their heads. The room's strange tension seemed to center around the man on the gallery. Tessa frowned. Had she interrupted some kind of speech, some private ceremony? The man never looked away. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, controlled. Yet somehow it carried across the entire ballroom. "Repeat what you just said," Tessa blinked. "What?" The phrase. The room remained frozen, waiting. Tessa glanced around uneasily. "It's nothing," she said. "Just something my grandmother used to say." Nobody looked relieved. Several faces grew even more alarmed. The man above remained perfectly still. "Repeat it." This time it sounded less like a request. Tessa swallowed. The silence felt heavier now, stranger, like she had accidentally stepped into the middle of a conversation that had begun centuries before she was born. Slowly, uncertainly, she repeated the words. "May silence guard the house and memory guard the night." Somewhere across the ballroom, a glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the floor. And at that exact moment, what Tessa Morgan didn't know was that she had just spoken a sentence that was supposed to have disappeared from the world more than 200 years ago. Some secrets do not survive because they are protected. They survive because everyone is too afraid to speak of them. The shattered glass seemed impossibly loud in the silence that followed. Tiny fragments scattered across the marble floor, glittering beneath the chandeliers like frozen stars. Tessa Morgan stood beside her cleaning cart, still gripping the handle, still trying to understand why an ordinary sentence had turned an entire room into statues. No one rushed to clean the broken glass. No one returned to their conversations. Every eye remained fixed on her. The man standing on the gallery above had not moved. His dark suit blended into the shadows behind him, yet somehow he remained the most visible person in the room. Tessa could not clearly see his face, but she could feel his attention. It was focused entirely on her. A woman near one of the columns finally found her voice. "That is impossible." Another guest immediately glanced toward the gallery as if regretting the words. The room fell silent again. "Look, if I interrupted something, I am sorry," she said. "It is just an old saying." Nobody seemed reassured. The man above slowly descended a staircase at the far end of the ballroom. His footsteps were measured and calm. He did not hurry. He did not need to. The room appeared to move around him. People stepped aside before he reached them. Conversations died before they began. By the time he crossed the ballroom floor, Tessa realized she was holding her breath. Up close he looked younger than she expected, perhaps. Dark hair, sharp features, a calm expression that revealed almost nothing. Yet there was something unusual about him, not his appearance, his stillness. Most people shifted their weight, adjusted their posture, glanced around a room. He did none of those things. He seemed perfectly composed, as though every movement had been carefully chosen before it happened. He stopped several feet away from her cleaning cart. "Where did you learn those words?" he asked. His voice was lower than she expected, not threatening, not angry. Somehow that made the question more unsettling. "My grandmother," Tessa answered. She used to say it all the time. A flicker crossed his expression. It disappeared almost immediately. "Your grandmother taught you the entire phrase?" "Yes, and she never explained it." Tessa shook her head. "It was just something she said around the house." The man studied her for a long moment. Around them, dozens of people remained frozen in place. Watching, listening, waiting. Tessa suddenly felt as though she had wandered into a meeting where everyone else had received instructions she never got. "What is going on?" she finally asked. "Why is everybody acting like I started a fire?" Several people exchanged uneasy glances. The man ignored the question entirely. "What was your grandmother's name?" "Margaret Morgan." The reaction this time was subtle but unmistakable. Something shifted behind his eyes, not recognition exactly, more like calculation. At that exact moment, less than 20 feet away, an older woman standing beside a marble column quietly raised a phone and sent a message. 3 words. He found her. Tessa never noticed the man looked toward her cleaning cart. A faded employee badge hung from the side pocket. His gaze settled briefly on her name before returning to her face. Tessa Morgan, that is usually how name tags work. For the first time, a faint trace of amusement appeared in his eyes. It vanished almost instantly. "You should go home, Miss Morgan," the answer surprised her. "That is it. For tonight and tomorrow." The room seemed to tighten around the question. The man glanced toward the towering windows where rain had begun tapping softly against the glass. Then he looked back at her. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "someone is going to ask you many more questions." He turned and walked away. The crowd immediately parted before him. Tessa watched him disappear through a set of massive doors at the far end of the ballroom. Only after he was gone did the room begin breathing again. Conversations returned in nervous whispers. Guests exchanged worried looks. Staff members suddenly found reasons to leave. Within minutes, the ballroom was emptying. Tessa stood alone beside her cart, more confused than ever. What she did not know was that upstairs, in a private office overlooking the city, security footage from every camera in Crimson Hall was already being pulled onto a screen, and at the center of every frame was a cleaner who had somehow spoken a language that history claimed had died more than 2 centuries ago. The people who change history are rarely the ones who know they are standing at the center of it. Chicago looked gray and exhausted beneath the early morning rain. By the time Tessa Morgan reached her apartment building, the sky was beginning to lighten behind the clouds. Water dripped from fire escapes. Delivery trucks rolled through empty streets. Somewhere nearby, a train rattled across elevated tracks. Everything felt normal again. That should have comforted her. Instead, it made the events at Crimson Hall seem even stranger. Her apartment sat on the 3rd floor of a brick building that had seen better decades. The hallway lights buzzed faintly overhead as she climbed the stairs. Inside, the apartment was small but clean. A narrow kitchen occupied one corner. A worn sofa sat beside a bookshelf crowded with second-hand novels. Framed photographs covered a nearby wall. Most of them featured one person, her grandmother. Tessa dropped her keys into a ceramic bowl and stood quietly for a moment. The silence felt different after the ballroom, less mysterious, more lonely. She slipped off her jacket and moved toward the bookshelf. An old photograph rested beside a stack of books. In it, a younger Margaret Morgan stood outside a farmhouse somewhere in rural Illinois. Wind tugged at her dark hair. Her smile seemed caught between happiness and sadness. Tessa picked up the frame. "What exactly did you teach me?" she whispered. The question lingered unanswered. Across the city, nearly 15 miles away, a wall-sized monitor illuminated a dark office overlooking the Chicago skyline. Security footage played repeatedly, different camera angles, different zoom levels, the same moment, again and again. A young cleaner speaking a simple sentence. Seated at a long table beneath dim lighting, several men and women watched the recordings in silence. Ancient books rested open beside laptops. Historical records covered the surface of the table. Nobody seemed interested in sleep. At the head of the room sat Sebastian Romano. His expression remained unreadable as another clip ended. "Play it again," someone requested. The footage restarted. The sentence echoed through the speakers. Silence settled over the room. Finally, an elderly scholar adjusted his glasses. "There is no mistake," he said quietly. "The pronunciation is correct." Another woman shook her head. "That should not be possible." Yet it happened. Sebastian's voice remained calm. "Find another explanation." Nobody spoke. The scholar closed one of the books before him. The leather cover looked centuries old. The phrase appears only 4 times in surviving records. Every reference ends approximately 220 years ago. "Meaning?" Sebastian asked. "Meaning nobody should know it." Back in her apartment, Tessa opened a cabinet above the kitchen sink and reached toward the back shelf. Her fingers brushed against a worn leather notebook. She hesitated. The journal had belonged to her grandmother. Most of it contained recipes, shopping lists, and family notes. Carrying the notebook to the kitchen table, she flipped through yellowed pages. Familiar handwriting filled the margins. Memories returned instantly. Summer afternoons, lemon tea, long conversations, advice that made more sense years later than it had at the time. Page after page revealed nothing unusual. Grocery lists, gardening notes, holiday reminders. Then something caught her attention. Near the bottom of one page, written in faded ink, sat a sentence she recognized immediately. "May silence guard the house and memory guard the night." Tessa stared at the words. Her grandmother had underlined them twice. Beneath the sentence appeared a small symbol she had never noticed before. A circle surrounded by 4 narrow lines, extending outward like compass points. She turned the page searching for an explanation. There was none, just more ordinary notes. Yet the symbol appeared again several pages later, then again. Each time drawn carefully in the margins. Rain tapped against the apartment window. The room suddenly felt colder. Tessa looked at the clock, nearly 6:30 in the morning. She should have been asleep already. Instead, she sat studying symbols she did not understand while remembering a ballroom full of frightened faces. Then her phone vibrated. The sound made her jump. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. Eventually, she answered. "Hello?" A calm female voice responded immediately. "Good morning, Miss Morgan. This is regarding an appointment that has been arranged for you." Tessa frowned. "What appointment?" There was a brief pause. "You are requested at Crimson Hall this afternoon." The words sent a chill through her chest. "Requested by who?" Another pause, longer this time. Then the woman answered with careful precision. "By the man you spoke to last night." The moment an ordinary person receives an invitation from powerful people, life stops feeling ordinary. Tessa stared at the phone long after the call ended. The apartment seemed quieter than before. Rain continued tapping against the window. Cars moved through the street below. Somewhere in the building, a television played behind a neighboring wall. Everything sounded distant. She set the phone on the kitchen table and looked again at her grandmother's journal. The strange symbol seemed almost deliberate now, as if it had been waiting years for someone to notice it. By noon, curiosity had defeated hesitation. Tessa boarded a train downtown and spent the ride staring through rain-speckled glass. Chicago passed by in blurred reflections. Office towers rose above the clouds. Traffic crawled through wet streets. Every mile brought her closer to questions she did not want, and answers she was not sure she was ready to hear. Crimson Hall looked different during the day. The towering stone exterior appeared less mysterious beneath grey skies. Business people entered through revolving doors. Delivery trucks unloaded supplies along the side entrance. It looked like any luxury venue in the city. Yet the moment Tessa stepped inside, she felt the same strange tension she had felt the previous night. A woman in a dark navy suit greeted her immediately. "Miss Morgan?" Tessa nodded. "Please follow me." No reception desk, no paperwork, no explanation. The woman simply led her through a series of hallways she had never seen before. The public sections of the building gradually disappeared behind them. Marble corridors became quieter. Security doors appeared. Elevator access required keycards. The deeper they went, the more Tessa realized she had spent 2 years working inside this building without ever seeing most of it. Finally, they stopped outside a set of tall wooden doors. The woman opened one and stepped aside. "He is waiting." Tessa entered cautiously. The room beyond resembled a private library more than an office. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of books lined the walls. Rainlight filtered through tall windows overlooking the city. A large desk stood near the center of the room. Behind it sat the man from the ballroom, Sebastian Romano. He looked exactly as she remembered, calm, composed, impossible to read. "Thank you for coming," he said. The woman quietly closed the doors behind her. "You made it sound optional." A faint trace of amusement touched his expression. "Fair observation." He gestured toward a chair across from the desk. Tessa sat. Sebastian remained standing for a moment, studying her with the same unsettling focus he had shown the night before. Not rude, not aggressive, just observant, like someone trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, he walked toward the windows. "Your grandmother," he said. "How long did she live with you?" "Most of my life, and she taught you that phrase, among other things." Sebastian nodded slightly. "Did she ever explain where she learned it?" "No." "Did she leave any documents?" Tessa hesitated. The journal suddenly felt heavier inside her bag. "Maybe." His eyes shifted toward her. "Maybe, mostly family stuff. Recipes, notes, nothing exciting. May I see it?" The request came too quickly. Tessa frowned. Why? Silence followed. Rain slid down the windows behind him. The skyline looked washed in silver. For the first time, Sebastian seemed to consider his next words carefully, because that phrase should not exist anymore. Tessa felt a chill travel through her chest. People keep saying that, because it is true. He moved toward one of the bookshelves and removed a thin leather volume. Setting it on the desk, he opened several pages. The paper looked impossibly old. Delicate handwriting covered the margins. This archive contains surviving references to the phrase. Tessa leaned forward, her eyes widened. There it was, the exact sentence, written in faded ink. Beneath it appeared the same symbol from her grandmother's journal, the same circle, the same 4 lines. Her pulse quickened. "What is that symbol?" she asked quietly. For the first time since entering the room, Sebastian did not answer immediately. His gaze settled on the page, then on her. "That," he said, "is exactly what I was hoping you could tell me." Sometimes the most important clue is the one that has been sitting in your home for years. Tessa stared at the symbol on the ancient page. The lines were identical, every curve, every angle. There was no possibility of coincidence. The same mark appeared inside her grandmother's journal. For several seconds, neither she nor Sebastian spoke. Rain drifted across the tall windows behind him. The city skyline shimmered beneath thick grey clouds. Finally, Tessa reached into her bag. "I did not bring it here to hand over," she said carefully, "but I think you should see this." She removed the worn notebook and placed it on the desk. Sebastian looked at the faded cover without touching it. The journal seemed strangely ordinary compared to the centuries-old books surrounding them. A simple leather notebook, frayed edges, creased spine, the kind of thing nobody would notice at a yard sale. Yet the moment he opened it, the atmosphere in the room changed. His attention sharpened. Tessa watched him flip through pages of recipes, household notes, and handwritten reminders. Nothing unusual appeared at first. Then he reached one of the marked pages. The ancient phrase sat beneath a grocery list. The symbol appeared beside it. Sebastian stopped turning pages. "How long have you had this?" "Since my grandmother passed away, and nobody else has seen it, not that I know of." He continued reading. Several more symbols appeared throughout the notebook. Most were hidden in corners or tucked into margins. They looked meaningless until viewed together. Sebastian turned to a blank page and began sketching them in sequence. Circle, lines, additional marks, tiny variations. Tessa leaned forward. "What are you doing?" And Sebastian said nothing. He finished the final drawing and sat back. The collection of symbols now resembled something larger, not random notes, not decoration, a map. Tessa felt her pulse quicken. "You are kidding. I rarely do." His finger tapped one section of the page. "These markings repeat every 20 pages. What does that mean?" "It means your grandmother was organizing information." Tessa looked again. Once pointed out, the structure became obvious. The symbols were not scattered. They followed a sequence, like directions, like instructions. Before she could respond, a knock sounded at the door. A woman entered carrying a thin folder. She approached Sebastian and quietly handed it to him. He opened it. His expression remained controlled, but Tessa noticed his eyes narrow slightly. "What is it?" she asked. Sebastian closed the folder. "Background research. On me? On your grandmother?" The answer made her uneasy, and he studied her for a moment. According to every public record available, Margaret Morgan spent most of her life working as a librarian in Springfield. "That sounds right. Unfortunately, there is a problem." Tessa folded her arms. "What kind of problem?" Sebastian opened the folder again and slid a document across the desk. Tessa read the first page, then the second. Employment records, tax records, property records. Everything appeared normal until the final page. There, listed among archived government files, was a 7-year gap. No address, no employment. No records of any kind. Margaret Morgan simply disappeared from official documentation, then reappeared years later without explanation. That cannot be right, Tessa said quietly. She never mentioned anything like this. Most people do not erase 7 years by accident. Rain struck the windows harder now. The office seemed darker than before. Tessa looked down at the journal. Suddenly it felt less like a family keepsake and more like a locked door she had unknowingly carried her entire life. Sebastian closed the notebook gently. Miss Morgan, I believe your grandmother knew exactly what this symbol means. Then why never tell me? Perhaps she was waiting until you were ready. Ready for what? For the first time, uncertainty appeared in Sebastian's expression. It vanished almost immediately, but Tessa caught it. That, he said quietly, is what we are about to find out. Then he turned the journal toward her and pointed to a mark hidden near the bottom of a page. Tessa's breath caught. Until that moment, she had thought the symbols formed a map. She was wrong. They formed directions. And the final instruction pointed to a location beneath Chicago itself. Every city hides a second version of itself beneath the streets, buried under time and forgotten by everyone above. The location marked inside Margaret Morgan's journal did not point toward a building, a neighborhood, or an address. It pointed beneath one. Less than 2 hours later, Tessa found herself riding in the passenger seat of a black sedan as rain streaked across the windows. Downtown Chicago slowly disappeared behind them. Neither she nor Sebastian spoke much during the drive. The journal rested on her lap. The pages seemed heavier now, as though every mile brought them closer to a secret her grandmother had spent decades protecting. Eventually the vehicle stopped near an abandoned freight station on the western edge of the city. Rust covered the old metal framework. Broken windows reflected the grey afternoon sky. Tall weeds pushed through cracked pavement. It looked like the kind of place people passed every day without noticing. Tessa stepped out and stared at the structure. "This is it?" she asked. Sebastian glanced toward the journal. "According to the markings, my grandmother hid something here, or someone wanted future generations to find something here." The distinction unsettled her. Together they crossed the empty lot. Rainwater collected in shallow puddles around old railroad tracks. The freight station itself appeared deserted. No workers, no equipment, no signs of recent activity. Yet when Tessa opened the journal again, she noticed something she had missed before. One symbol aligned perfectly with a stone marker near the entrance. Another matched a weathered steel support beam. A third pointed toward a sealed maintenance corridor beneath the station. Her pulse quickened. The symbols were not merely directions. They were landmarks. "She actually mapped this place," Tessa whispered. Sebastian studied the corridor entrance. "It appears so. A rusted gate blocked the passage. Time had nearly erased it from view. Behind it, concrete stairs descended into darkness. Water dripped steadily from somewhere below. The sound echoed upward through the narrow tunnel. "You do this often, investigate forgotten mysteries hidden beneath major cities?" Sebastian asked. "Not recently." To her surprise, the answer almost made her smile. Almost together they descended. The air grew cooler with every step. The sounds of traffic gradually faded until only dripping water remained. Old maintenance lights lined the tunnel walls. Though most had stopped working decades earlier, their flashlights cut narrow beams through the darkness. The journal guided them deeper. Left turn, narrow passage, another staircase. Every instruction matched perfectly. Whoever created the symbols had known this place intimately. After nearly 15 minutes underground, the tunnel opened into a circular chamber. Tessa stopped immediately. The room was unlike anything she expected. Stone walls surrounded a central platform carved from pale limestone. Dust covered every surface, yet the architecture did not resemble modern Chicago. It looked far older, older than the city itself, older than the freight station above. "This cannot be real," she whispered. Sebastian said nothing. His attention remained fixed on carvings etched into the walls. Rows of symbols stretched around the chamber in perfect circles. Some matched the marks inside the journal, others did not. Tessa slowly approached the platform. Her flashlight passed across an inscription carved into the stone. The letters appeared unfamiliar at first. Then recognition struck. Her breath caught. She had seen them before, inside the ancient book in Sebastian's office, beside the forgotten phrase. "This is the same language," she said quietly. For the first time since entering the chamber, Sebastian looked genuinely surprised. "You can recognize it. Only pieces." Tessa pointed towards several symbols. "Those repeat throughout the journal." Silence followed. Heavy, significant. Then Sebastian stepped closer to one section of the wall. His flashlight illuminated a carved emblem hidden beneath centuries of dust. A circle surrounded by 4 lines extending outward like compass points. The exact symbol from Margaret's notebook, except this version included words beneath it, words that neither of them had noticed until now. Sebastian brushed away the remaining dust. The inscription became fully visible. Tessa stared at it. Sebastian stared at it. Neither spoke for several seconds, because beneath the symbol was proof that her grandmother's journal was connected to something far older than either of them imagined. And carved directly into the stone were 3 words that changed everything. Human Guardian's Archive. History does not disappear on its own. Someone always chooses what gets remembered and what gets erased. The words carved into the stone seemed impossible to ignore. Human Guardian's Archive. Tessa stood motionless beneath the beam of her flashlight while dust drifted through the cold underground air. For years she had believed her grandmother was simply a quiet woman who loved books, tea, and old stories. Now every memory felt different. Every forgotten conversation seemed to hide another layer she had never noticed. Beside her, Sebastian studied the inscription without speaking. The chamber remained silent, except for the distant sound of water dripping somewhere deeper beneath the city. "You knew about this?" Tessa finally asked. Sebastian shook his head. "I knew the term human guardians existed in scattered references. I did not know a physical archive survived." His answer surprised her. For the first time since they met, he sounded less certain than usual, almost unsettled. Tessa turned her flashlight toward the circular walls. Hundreds of symbols surrounded them. Some were faded by time, others remained remarkably clear. The chamber felt less like a hiding place and more like a vault designed to preserve something important. Then she noticed a narrow seam running through the stone platform at the center of the room. "Sebastian." He followed her gaze. The platform was not solid. A rectangular section had been carefully concealed within it. Together they approached. The journal symbols matched several carvings along the edge. One by one, Tessa compared them. Circle, compass lines, additional markings. The sequence aligned perfectly. "It is some kind of lock," she said. Sebastian glanced toward the notebook. "Try following the order." Her fingers traced the carved symbols exactly as they appeared inside Margaret's journal. The final symbol clicked softly beneath her touch. A deep mechanical sound echoed through the chamber. Stone-shifted dust cascaded from the ceiling. Slowly the concealed section of the platform slid aside. Beneath it rested a narrow compartment protected from time and moisture. Inside lay a single object. Simple, weathered, untouched for decades, Tessa carefully lifted it out. Despite its age, the lock had already been released. Someone had intended for it to be opened eventually. The lid creaked softly. Inside rested dozens of preserved documents wrapped in protective cloth. Maps, letters, journals, official seals. Tessa unfolded the first document she found. The paper crackled gently. The heading at the top immediately caught Sebastian's attention. "What is it?" she asked. His eyes remained fixed on the page. "A treaty." Tessa frowned. "Between who?" Sebastian looked at her. "Between the vampire court and the human guardians." The words seemed to absorb all the air from the room. For years she had heard stories portraying ancient conflicts, rivalries, and divisions. Yet the document in her hands described something entirely different. Cooperation, partnership, shared responsibilities, shared laws, shared protection. Tessa quickly opened another file, then another. The same pattern appeared everywhere. Joint agreements, diplomatic records, formal correspondence. None of it resembled the version of history she had been taught. "This does not make sense," she whispered. "Exactly." Sebastian took one of the documents and examined the signatures at the bottom. His expression darkened. According to every official archive, the human guardians disappeared after betraying the court over 2 centuries ago. Tessa looked around the chamber. "But these records say something else." "They do," silence returned, heavy and undeniable. The deeper they searched, the clearer the truth became. The human guardians had not been enemies. They had been trusted allies, partners. Protectors of knowledge shared between 2 worlds. Tessa slowly lowered one of the documents. Her grandmother had not left behind random symbols. She had preserved evidence that someone had wanted forgotten. Then Sebastian stopped turning pages. His eyes narrowed at a final document hidden beneath the others. The paper was damaged. Several sections were missing, but one line remained perfectly readable. Tessa leaned closer, her breath caught as she read it. Because the document revealed the true name of the agreement tied to the ancient phrase she had spoken in the ballroom, the silent oath. The most dangerous lie is not the one people tell. It is the one written into history until everyone accepts it as truth. The chamber felt smaller after the discovery. The silent oath. Even the name seemed to carry weight. Tessa sat on the edge of the stone platform while documents surrounded her in careful stacks. Pages that had remained hidden beneath Chicago for more than 2 centuries now lay exposed beneath flashlight beams. Every file she opened revealed the same insuperable reality: cooperation, trust, shared responsibility. Nothing resembled the betrayal described in official historical records. Across from her, Sebastian methodically photographed each document before returning it to protective sleeves. His movements remained calm, but Tessa could sense something changing. Every new page challenged information he had likely accepted his entire life. How could nobody know about this? She asked quietly. Sebastian glanced toward the rows of records lining the chamber walls. Perhaps somebody did. The answer lingered between them. Tessa looked down at a weathered map, showing old trade routes between settlements. Human communities and vampire territories appeared connected by dozens of marked paths, not divided, not hostile. Connected, if these records are real, she said. Then everything people believe about the human guardians is wrong. Possibly. Tessa held up another document. This says they protected archives, negotiated disputes, and maintained communication between both sides. That does not sound like betrayal. Sebastian remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he closed the file he was reading. History is rarely as simple as people prefer. The response frustrated her. You still think there is another explanation. I think we have only part of the story. Before she could respond, Sebastian unfolded one of the larger documents recovered from the archive. The paper appeared damaged along one side. Portions had clearly been removed long ago, yet enough remained to reveal a timeline. Tessa moved closer. Together they examined dates, locations, and signatures. The further they followed the records, the stranger everything became. Several major historical events described in official archives appeared completely different here. Entire meetings had been omitted. Important figures were missing from public records altogether. It was not one discrepancy, it was hundreds. This was deliberate, Tessa whispered. Sebastian nodded slowly. Someone rewrote the narrative. The realization settled heavily over the chamber. Not a misunderstanding, an accident. Deliberate revision. Tessa looked around at the preserved archive. Her grandmother had spent years protecting evidence because somebody had hidden the truth. Suddenly, the 7 missing years in Margaret Morgan's life made more sense. She had not disappeared. She had been guarding something. Then Tessa noticed another symbol near the bottom of a document. Unlike the others, this one included a reference code. Sebastian immediately recognized it. That should not be here. What is it? She asked. His eyes narrowed. A catalogue number for what? An item stored in the Royal Historical Museum. Tessa blinked. Wait. If that item is in a museum, why is it referenced here? Because according to official records, it should not exist. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Sebastian reached for his phone. Less than 30 minutes later, they emerged from the underground tunnels into cold evening air. Rain had finally stopped. The city glowed beneath reflected streetlights. Traffic moved through wet intersections while office towers illuminated the darkening sky. Everything appeared normal, yet beneath that ordinary city sat evidence capable of rewriting centuries of accepted history. The museum occupied several floors inside one of Chicago's oldest cultural buildings. By the time they arrived, public hours had ended. Most visitors were gone. Interior lights reflected across polished stone corridors. Security personnel greeted Sebastian immediately and granted access without question. Tessa noticed the reaction, but said nothing. They moved through galleries filled with historical artifacts until they reached a restricted archive room. Inside, shelves stretched toward the ceiling. Thousands of catalogued items sat organized behind glass. Sebastian located the reference number within minutes. The artifact itself was small, a sealed display case containing a leather document folder. Nothing remarkable at first glance, until Tessa read the identification plaque. Her stomach tightened. The description claimed the folder represented one of the final surviving records from the collapse of relations between the court and the human guardians. Yet the catalogue number matched a document they had just discovered hidden underground. The dates were identical, the signatures were identical. The only difference was the story being told. Tessa slowly turned toward Sebastian. The archive says one thing, the museum says another. Sebastian stared at the display case. His expression hardened, because for the first time they were no longer dealing with missing history. They were staring directly at proof that someone had intentionally replaced it. A hidden truth becomes far more dangerous the moment someone proves it was hidden on purpose. The museum archive felt colder after that realization. Tessa stood motionless in front of the display case while visitors' footsteps echoed faintly somewhere beyond the restricted section. Rows of carefully preserved artifacts stretched into the distance, each one labeled, catalogued, and explained. Yet now she could not stop wondering how many of those explanations were actually true. Sebastian remained focused on the document behind the glass. The calm certainty that usually surrounded him seemed thinner than before. "Can it be opened?" Tessa asked. "It can," Sebastian replied. "The question is whether it should. If someone changed history, I think we are past worrying about museum rules." For the first time that evening, the corner of his mouth almost lifted, almost. Within minutes, a curator arrived carrying authorization records and access equipment. The display case was unlocked carefully. The leather folder was transferred onto a preservation table beneath controlled lighting. Tessa watched as the curator unfolded the document with practiced precision. At first glance it appeared authentic. Official seals, historical signatures, matching dates, everything aligned with the museum description. Then Sebastian placed one of the underground archive documents beside it. Silence settled across the room. The similarities were undeniable. So were the differences. Entire paragraphs had been removed. Key names were missing. Several sentences had been replaced altogether. The original text described cooperation and negotiations. The museum version described distrust and separation, the same event. Two completely different stories. The curator's face slowly lost color. "This cannot be right," she whispered. "These records were authenticated generations ago." Tessa leaned closer. "Look at the signatures." The curator followed her finger. On both documents the signatures matched perfectly. Yet one crucial section existed only in the original archive copy, a formal declaration confirming that the human guardians had remained loyal participants in the silent oath. The room grew quiet. Even the curator seemed unwilling to speak the obvious conclusion. Finally, Sebastian did it for everyone. The original record was altered. The words landed heavily. Tessa felt a strange mixture of validation and sadness. They were finding answers, but every answer revealed a larger deception. Several hours later they returned to Crimson Hall carrying digital copies of every recovered document. Night had fallen over Chicago again. City lights reflected across wet streets. Clouds drifted between skyscrapers. The same city remained above them, unaware that a forgotten archive was quietly unraveling 2 centuries of accepted history. Inside a private conference room, historians, archivists, and legal scholars reviewed the evidence. Screens displayed scans from the underground vault alongside official records. One contradiction after another appeared. Missing pages, altered timelines, removed witnesses. Entire sections of history had been carefully reshaped. Not recklessly, systematically. Tessa sat near the far end of the table, listening. For the first time since this began, nobody treated her like an outsider. Questions were directed toward her. Notes from Margaret's journal were examined seriously. Her observations mattered. The feeling was unfamiliar. Across the room, Sebastian stood beside a large screen displaying a timeline assembled from the recovered documents. The archive proves the human guardians remained active long after the alleged betrayal, one researcher said. "Then why erase them?" another asked. No one answered immediately. Then a historian enlarged a document recovered from the underground chamber. Near the bottom sat a reference to a final investigation conducted shortly before the historical split. Tessa's attention sharpened. The historian adjusted his glasses. "It appears there was concern about internal corruption." The room fell silent. "Internal where?" Tessa asked. The historian swallowed. "Within the court itself." Several people exchanged uneasy looks. Sebastian stared at it too, because for the first time the question was no longer whether history had been altered. The evidence already proved that. The real question was who had benefited from rewriting it, and buried inside the final surviving records was a clue pointing directly toward the answer. The truth becomes impossible to ignore when it points toward the people who wrote the rules. The conference room remained silent long after the historian finished speaking. Rain no longer struck the windows outside. The city beyond Crimson Hall glowed beneath thousands of lights. Unaware that centuries of accepted history were being questioned inside a single room, Tessa stared at the screen displaying the recovered timeline. Internal corruption, the phrase lingered in her mind. Until now, every discovery had focused on the human guardians, their disappearance, their erased legacy, their forgotten role within the silent oath. But the evidence was beginning to point somewhere else entirely, not toward what the guardians had done, toward what someone inside the court had done. Across the room, researchers continued comparing documents recovered from the underground archive. One by one, patterns emerged. Missing records appeared connected. Altered testimonies referenced the same period. Several names repeated throughout the files, not as criminals, not as victims, as investigators. "Look at this," one archivist suddenly said. The room shifted toward another screen. A newly restored document appeared. Portions remained damaged, but enough survived to reveal its purpose. It was not a treaty. Not a diplomatic letter. It was an inquiry, an official review conducted shortly before relations between the court and the human guardians supposedly collapsed. Tessa leaned forward. What were they investigating? The archivist enlarged a section of text. Financial manipulation, concealment of historical records. Several people exchanged uneasy glances. Sebastian remained standing beside the table, studying the document carefully. His expression revealed nothing. Yet Tessa noticed the way his attention sharpened whenever another piece of evidence appeared. This was no longer an academic exercise. The inquiry had targeted influential figures connected to the leadership of that era. So the human guardians discovered something, Tessa said quietly. That appears likely, the archivist replied. And then they vanished from history, another researcher added. Silence followed. The connection felt impossible to ignore. Tessa looked down at Margaret Morgan's journal resting beside her. For years, her grandmother had protected fragments of a story larger than anyone realized, not because it was valuable, because it was dangerous. A legal scholar near the end of the table cleared his throat. There is another issue. Every eye turned toward him. He adjusted several documents before speaking. According to surviving records, a public tribunal was scheduled shortly before the historical separation occurred. A tribunal? Tessa asked. Yes, evidence was going to be presented before the entire court. The room grew even quieter. Sebastian slowly crossed his arms. And did it happen? The scholar shook his head. No record confirms it, because the records were erased, someone muttered. Perhaps. The scholar pointed toward another recovered page. However, this document suggests the hearing was prepared in detail. Witnesses were selected, statements were collected, evidence was organized. Tessa felt her pulse quicken. If the hearing had happened, the truth would have become public. If it had been stopped, everything that followed suddenly made more sense. Then another researcher opened a newly scanned file recovered from the archive compartment. The document appeared damaged, but one section remained perfectly legible. A list of attendees expected at the tribunal. Tessa scanned the names. Most meant nothing to her. Then she noticed Sebastian, staring at the screen. For the first time since meeting him, genuine shock appeared in his eyes. Not fear, not uncertainty, recognition. You know that name, Tessa said. The room turned toward him. Sebastian remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he nodded. I do. Who is it? Tessa asked. His gaze never left the document. The individual who ordered the historical revisions after the separation. The room froze. How do you know that? Someone asked. Sebastian took a slow breath. Because the name belongs to a member of the ruling council from 220 years ago. Tessa felt the weight of the revelation settle over everyone present. The corruption investigation had been real. The human guardians had been gathering evidence. The tribunal had been prepared. And now, for the first time, they had discovered the identity of someone who benefited when the truth disappeared. Yet what unsettled Tessa most was not the name itself. It was the realization that the final missing documents might still exist somewhere, and if they did, they could prove exactly what happened on the day history changed forever. The hardest decision a leader can make is choosing truth when a lie has protected the world for generations. Nobody spoke for several moments after Sebastian revealed the significance of the name. The conference room seemed smaller now. The evidence scattered across tables no longer felt like historical records. They felt like pieces of a verdict waiting to be delivered. Outside the windows, Chicago shimmered beneath a blanket of city lights. Inside, centuries of certainty continued to unravel. Tessa looked around the room. Historians, archivists, legal scholars. Every face carried the same expression. They had crossed a line. There was no returning to the official version of events now. If the corruption investigation was real, one researcher finally said, then the human guardians were not responsible for the collapse. Correct, Sebastian replied, and if the tribunal was stopped before evidence became public, another added, then someone had a reason to silence the process. Tessa glanced toward the stack of recovered documents. Her grandmother's journal rested among them, a simple notebook that had somehow survived long enough to expose a lie older than the city itself. What happens next? She asked. The question shifted every eye toward Sebastian. For the first time since this began, the answer seemed larger than research, larger than archives, larger than hidden chambers beneath Chicago. Sebastian walked toward the windows overlooking the city. Reflections from nearby skyscrapers moved across the glass. He stood there silently for several seconds before speaking. The evidence will be presented. The room immediately reacted. Some nodded, others exchanged worried glances. One legal advisor stood. You understand what that means. I do. The Historical Council will challenge everything. Perhaps some members will refuse to accept it. Sebastian turned back toward the room. His expression remained calm. But there was a firmness beneath it that Tessa had not seen before. The truth does not become less true because people dislike it. Silence followed. The statement settled heavily over everyone present. Tessa watched him carefully. Throughout the investigation, he had remained cautious, analytical, reluctant to draw conclusions too quickly. Now something had changed. The evidence had forced a choice, and he had made it. Less than an hour later, preparations began. A formal assembly would be called. Historians would present findings. Documents would be authenticated publicly. The surviving records of the silent oath would finally be examined before the entire court. As researchers organized materials, Tessa moved toward one of the conference tables. Her attention settled on a photograph that had fallen from Margaret's journal. She had seen it before but never studied it closely. The image showed her grandmother standing beside several people outside a stone building. Most faces were unfamiliar, except now she noticed something strange. The symbol of the human guardians appeared carved above the doorway behind them, hidden in plain sight. Preserved inside a family photograph for decades, Sebastian approached quietly. "You found something." Tessa handed him the photograph. He studied it for several moments. "She was protecting more than documents," Tessa said softly. "She was protecting memory." And she succeeded. The words meant more than she expected. For years Tessa had believed her grandmother lived an ordinary life. Now she understood the courage hidden beneath that quiet existence. Not fame, not power. Simply the determination to preserve the truth long enough for someone else to find it. Across the room, final preparations continued. Screens displayed timelines. Researchers organized evidence packets. Legal teams verified authentication records. Everything pointed toward tomorrow's assembly. Tomorrow, the story officially taught for over 2 centuries would face its first real challenge. Tessa looked again at the photograph, then toward Sebastian. For the first time since they met, neither mystery nor suspicion stood between them, only a shared responsibility. Then a notification appeared on one of the large conference screens. The final authentication report had arrived. Every recovered document from the underground archive had been verified as genuine. The room fell silent once more, because the truth was no longer a theory, and by sunrise, an entire court would be forced to decide what to do with it. When a forgotten truth finally reaches the light, the silence that protected it begins to break. Morning arrived beneath a clear sky. For the first time in days, Chicago stood without rain. Sunlight reflected from glass towers and poured across the upper floors of Crimson Hall. Inside the Grand Assembly chamber, rows of seats stretched beneath vaulted ceilings and towering windows. Historians, legal scholars, council representatives, and invited observers filled the room. Conversations remained quiet, controlled, yet tension lingered beneath every word. Tessa Morgan stood near the rear entrance, holding Margaret's journal against her chest. The massive chamber felt overwhelming. Only a week earlier she had been cleaning floors in the same building. Now she stood at the center of an event that could alter how generations understood their history. Across the room, Sebastian Romano reviewed final documents with several advisors. His expression remained calm, but the weight of the moment was impossible to ignore. The assembly began precisely at 10 o'clock. The room gradually settled into silence. One by one, researchers presented their findings. Authentication reports appeared on large screens. Digital scans from the underground archive were compared against official records. Timelines aligned, signatures matched. Expert testimony confirmed what months of investigation might normally have required. The recovered documents were genuine. The archive beneath Chicago was authentic, and the silent oath had existed exactly as the records described. Tessa watched faces throughout the chamber. Some listeners appeared shocked. Others seemed reluctant. A few simply looked exhausted, as though they were witnessing the collapse of assumptions they had carried for years. Then came the most important presentation. The original treaty documents appeared on the central screen. Carefully preserved signatures lined the bottom of each page. Clauses describing cooperation between the court and the human guardians filled the display. There was no hostility, no betrayal, no declaration of conflict, only partnership. The evidence spoke for itself. Murmurs spread through the audience. Several council members exchanged uneasy looks, others lowered their eyes toward their notes. Then the final report was introduced. The investigation records, the corruption inquiry, the tribunal that had been scheduled but never completed. One historian stepped forward and summarized the findings. Evidence indicated that members of a previous ruling council had faced accusations involving concealed records and misuse of authority. Before the inquiry could reach a public conclusion, official historical revisions began appearing across multiple archives. The timing was impossible to ignore. Tessa felt the atmosphere shift. For the first time, nobody was debating whether history had been altered. The discussion had moved beyond that. The room was confronting why. Sebastian eventually rose from his seat and approached the front of the chamber. Silence followed him. No announcement was necessary. Everyone watched. The evidence presented today establishes 3 facts, he said, his voice carried clearly through the hall. First, the silent oath was real. Second, the human guardians served as trusted partners, not enemies. Third, historical records were intentionally altered after the collapse of the tribunal. The chamber remained silent. We cannot change what happened 220 years ago, Sebastian continued. But we can choose whether to continue repeating a false version of it. Tessa looked around the room. No one interrupted. No one challenged the evidence. The documents had become too overwhelming. The truth had finally accumulated enough weight to stand on its own. Then something unexpected happened. One of the senior council representatives slowly stood. After a moment another followed, then another, not in protest, in acknowledgement. Around the chamber people rose from their seats one after another, historians, archivists, scholars, representatives. The gesture spread through the room until nearly everyone stood together. Tessa felt her throat tighten, not because they were honoring her, because they were honoring the truth her grandmother had protected for decades. The truth was no longer hidden underground. It no longer depended on secret journals or forgotten archives. It belonged to everyone now. Then the chairman of the assembly stepped forward with a formal document in his hands. The declaration would become part of the permanent historical record, and before the day ended, the world would officially learn that the human guardians had never betrayed the silent oath at all. The value of a life is not measured by how many people notice it, but by what remains true because it existed. The declaration was signed before sunset. By evening, copies had already entered permanent archives. Historians updated records, researchers published findings. Institutions that had repeated the same version of events for generations began correcting them. The human guardians were no longer remembered as traitors. Their names were restored to history alongside the silent oath they had helped preserve. For the first time in more than 2 centuries, the truth stood where the lie had once stood. Tessa Morgan remained in the Grand Assembly chamber long after most people had left. The enormous room felt different now, lighter somehow. Sunlight faded beyond the towering windows, painting the marble floor with gold and amber reflections. Workers quietly gathered materials from the day's proceedings. Historians packed documents into protective cases. Conversations drifted through the hall, no longer tense but thoughtful. The crisis was over, the mystery had been solved, the truth had survived. Tessa looked down at Margaret's journal resting in her hands. The worn leather cover carried new meaning now. Her grandmother had spent decades protecting fragments of history that almost disappeared forever. Not because anyone promised recognition, not because anyone guaranteed success. She had simply believed that truth mattered. Tessa smiled softly. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." A familiar voice answered from nearby. She did not do it alone. Tessa looked up. Sebastian Romano stood several feet away. The crowds were gone now. No advisors, no researchers, no officials waiting for instructions. Just the two of them standing inside the same hall where everything had begun. For a moment neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable, earned. "I never thanked you," Sebastian said. Tessa laughed quietly. "For accidentally causing historical chaos? For refusing to walk away from it?" The answer surprised her. She studied him for a moment. During the past week, she had seen him challenge assumptions, question traditions, and ultimately choose truth over convenience. The man standing before her no longer seemed distant, still composed, still reserved, but different. "You could have ignored the evidence," she said. "A lot of people would have. Perhaps. Why did you not?" Sebastian glanced toward the windows where the last light of day lingered above the skyline, because eventually a leader must decide whether his responsibility is to protect a story or protect the truth. The answer settled quietly between them. Tessa looked around the chamber one final time. Only days earlier she had crossed this floor pushing a cleaning cart while people passed by without noticing her. She had believed she was invisible, just another worker moving through someone else's world. Yet somehow she had become the person who restored a forgotten chapter of history, not because she was powerful, not because she was extraordinary, because she chose to ask questions, because she chose to keep going. Footsteps echoed softly through the hall as the last staff members departed. Evening shadows stretched across the marble. The room gradually emptied. Sebastian glanced toward the elevated platform where ceremonial seats stood beneath carved stone arches. Then he did something unexpected. Instead of walking toward it, he stepped away from it. He crossed the floor directly toward Tessa. No speeches, no audience, no ceremony. He simply stopped beside her. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then Sebastian extended his hand. Tessa looked at it, yet it carried the weight of everything that had happened. The silent oath, the hidden archive, Margaret's journal, the restored truth. A future built on honesty instead of silence. Slowly, she accepted it. Together they turned toward the exit. Around them the vast chamber stood quiet beneath the fading light. At the beginning of this story, Tessa Morgan had stood alone in a grand hall where nobody seemed to see her. Now she walked through that same hall beside someone who did, and as they disappeared into the warm glow beyond the doorway, the last rays of sunlight illuminated the restored symbol of the human guardians hanging above the chamber entrance, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten, and never to be erased again.